The smell hit him before the visual did. That sterile, antiseptic bite beneath something fouler, something organic and defeated. Staff Sergeant Paul Marin had been in enough field hospitals to recognize the scent of a place where living things were brought to die. He stood at the threshold of Intake Bay 7 and looked at what was left of the Vithori prisoner, and decided right then that he wasn't going to leave it here. It wasn't a decision built on strategy. It wasn't mercy in the noble abstracted sense. It was something simpler and harder to explain, the same thing that had made him, on his third deployment to the Candle Basin, crawl 200 meters through active fire to drag Lance Corporal Devis back to the perimeter. Devis had been breathing. That was enough. The Vethori in Bay 7 was breathing too, just barely, its bioluminescent gill frills cycling through the gray-blue of distress. And that, as far as Paul Marin was concerned, settled the question. "You can't bring it to the compound," said Sergeant Major Hollins from behind him. "Regulations and common sense." "Then I'll take it off base, Paul." "I've got 62 days of accumulated leave." Paul didn't look back. "I'll use some of it. That was 3 years ago." It felt like someone else's life. The kind of life you read about in after-action reports. Clean and distant, stripped of weather and smell, and the particular weight of having carried something for so long your bones had shaped themselves around it. The compound he rented was 12 clicks outside New Bastion, in the scrub flats where the terraforming had gone patchy and the sky still ran green at the horizon from the ionization fields. It wasn't much. 4 walls, 2 rooms, a generator that coughed in the cold, and enough perimeter space that his neighbors, the ones who remained after the resettlement waves, didn't have to see what he was doing unless they drove up to the gate, which they didn't usually. Paul wasn't the kind of man people drove up to visit. He had 14 of them now. He didn't call them prisoners. He didn't call them aliens, or Veth, or any of the other words the news feeds used, the words that turned living things into categories. He called them recruits, the same way he'd called every dog he'd ever trained, every new addition to a working unit that didn't yet know the rules, but would learn them, given time and patience, and the particular steadiness that came from someone not flinching when you were at your worst. "New recruit," he said, the morning he brought back the small one from the detention overflow facility outside Calver. He said it to the others assembled in the yard, the way he always said it, letting them look, letting them understand that the unit was growing, that they were not alone. The new one pressed itself against his leg, and the others shifted, communicating in the subsonic register Paul had spent 2 years learning to read, a frequency below human hearing that he felt in his back teeth and his sternum. He'd asked a xenolinguist about it once. The linguist had said it was probably territorial. Paul had watched the others settle in circle and slowly admit the newcomer into the loose warmth of the group, and thought, that's not territorial, that's community. He had learned to sleep lightly. The Vithori woke at different intervals than humans did, cycling through rest states in 90-minute windows rather than consolidated sleep. And for the first year, he'd spent most of his nights in a chair by the main enclosure. Not because they needed supervision, but because they'd needed to know someone was there. He understood that. He'd spent his own worst nights needing exactly the same thing. Someone present, someone who wouldn't leave. In Afghanistan, in the Candle Basin, in the 17 months of Jovian deployment that had given him the tinnitus in his right ear, and the tremor in his left hand, and the particular brand of hypervigilance that made grocery stores feel like ambush terrain, he had always slept better when someone else was breathing nearby. The tremor was worse in the cold. He noticed it most in the mornings, when he was prepping the nutrient solutions the Vethori required, a complex mineral suspension that had taken him 4 months of research and a lot of failed attempts to get right. His hands had learned to compensate. They'd learned most things, given enough repetition. There was a man in town named Reyes, Marcus Reyes, former combat engineer, 60% of his body surface area replaced with synth skin after an IED on the Ganymede transit route, who came out sometimes and sat with Paul on the porch. Reyes had lost the ability to regulate his own temperature after the injury, so he wore a cooling vest in summer and a heating rig in winter, and he had this habit of making jokes about it that somehow landed on the right side of everything, jokes that came from the inside of something rather than from a safe distance above it. He'd done a circuit of the USO recovery shows before the surgeries were finished, Reyes had. Made people laugh in hospital wards by describing the moment the medics had peeled him off the transit vehicle as being like getting a very aggressive exfoliation from someone with no training and no concern for your aftercare routine. Paul kept a flask in his jacket for those evenings. He'd pass it to Reyes, and Reyes would pass it back, and neither of them talked much, mostly. The Vathori would come to the fence line and observe, their gill frills shifting through colors Paul had catalogued. Amber for curiosity, pale blue for contentment, the rapid dark green cycling that meant something closer to amusement, which he'd never expected, and which still surprised him, that they could find things funny. "You know what the county's going to say, Reyes," said one evening. "I know what they're going to say. 14 is a lot." The facility outside Calver had 87 in a space rated for 20. 3 died last month from crowding stress. Paul took the flask back. 14 isn't a lot. Reyes looked at the fence line. One of the larger Vathori, the first one, the one from Intake Base 7, the one Paul had privately named something unprintable, was watching Reyes with what Paul had come to recognize as focused attention, its gill frills cycling slowly through pale amber. "It likes you," Paul said. "I look like I'm half alien already," Reyes said, indicating the synth skin. "Maybe it recognizes a kindred spirit." The county notice arrived 3 weeks later. 12 units maximum. Paul had 14. He had 30 days to bring himself into compliance. He read the notice twice, set it on the table, and sat with it for a while. Then he got up and went to the yard and told them about it the way he told them everything. Directly, without softening, the way you talked to unit members who deserved the truth. He couldn't say whether they understood the specific content of what he said. He was certain they understood the tone. The council representative who came out the following week was a woman named Sable, Deputy Administrator Sable, according to her identification chip, a title that seemed designed to communicate both authority and remove personal responsibility at the same time. She had the kind of face that had never been frightened of anything, which Paul recognized as a particular form of privilege. You only got that face if nothing had ever required you to be afraid. "Mr. Marin, the ordinance is clear. You're in violation. I'm aware of the ordinance. I'm asking for a variance. There's a process for that. The administrator has reviewed variance requests of this nature and—" "What nature?" He said it quietly. That was the thing about having been screamed at by people with actual power to hurt you. It made it very easy to be quiet and still when someone threatened you with paperwork. Be specific. What is the nature of this request? She was specific. She was also wrong on 3 procedural points that his lawyer, a compact, furious woman named Adira Chen, who had argued 4 cases before the Planetary Resettlement Tribunal, identified within the first 6 minutes of reviewing the documentation. "They're moving fast," Adira said. The administrator pushed this up the queue. "Usually a variance dispute takes 8 to 12 months. They've scheduled your hearing in 6 weeks. Why the rush?" Adira looked at him over the tops of her glasses, actual glasses, not lens implants, which Paul had always found inexplicably reassuring in a lawyer. "Because Administrator Corvin's re-election cycle starts in 4 months, and you are an extremely useful enemy for a man who's running on a consolidation platform." Paul understood. He'd been an extremely useful enemy before, in different contexts. The math of it was always the same. You needed something to point at, something that could be made to seem threatening. Something that made the pointing feel righteous. "What do I need to do?" "Nothing stupid," Adira said. "Can you commit to that?" "I've been committed to that for 3 years, she wrote something in her notes. "That's almost convincing. The thing about PTSD, the thing nobody explained to you going in, the thing the briefings and the pamphlets and the well-meaning counselors with their well-meaning frameworks never quite got to, was that it didn't make you irrational. It made you hyper-rational about certain things while completely short-circuiting others." Paul was very good at threat assessment. He was very good at reading a room, reading a person, reading the particular quality of silence that preceded violence. What he was less good at was managing the gap between threat identification and threat response, the cognitive break that in most people prevented the assessment from immediately becoming action. He managed it. He'd been managing it for years. He knew where the edges were. He didn't know, that particular Tuesday, that someone had already decided he was expendable. It started with the message. It came through his emergency contact channel, a frequency he'd registered with the county for exactly this kind of situation, routed to him by a young Vathori, designated in the county system as Detini 4 Gamma, but whom Paul had observed enough to understand was probably no older than 12, in Vathori developmental terms. The message, relayed through the emergency channel by a neighbor who'd found the young Vethori trying to signal toward Paul's compound, was simple. One of Paul's unit was injured in the far pasture east side, needed immediate attention. He grabbed his medkit and ran. The east pasture was empty. It was empty in the specific way that places are empty when they've recently been cleared, the way a room feels after someone has just left it. The air still disturbed, the ground still showing pressure. He stood there for 30 seconds, running the analysis, and then the wind shifted and he could smell the smoke. He ran back. 2 clicks. He ran it in 11 minutes, which was slower than he would have been before the Jovian deployment, but faster than anyone should be running in cold air at altitude. And he ran it with his chest on fire and his left hand trembling, and something behind his eyes going very quiet and very bright, the way it went in the Candle Basin when the shooting started, and everything that wasn't essential to survival simply switched off. 3 of them were dead, 2 more were badly burned. The main enclosure was gone. The structure he'd built himself over 8 months, the heated sections calibrated to Vethori thermal requirements, the filtration systems for the water supply, the lighting rigs set to the UV spectrum they needed. All of it. And in the road outside the gate, 3 figures laughing, young, the way people are young when they haven't yet learned the cost of things, when consequence is still abstract. One of them said something. Paul would not be able to recall, later, exactly what was said. He would recall that it rhymed with something cruel, and that the one who said it was grinning, and that Paul's left hand had stopped trembling. The next 11 minutes were also not something he would recall in precise sequence. He recalled the quiet afterward. He recalled looking at his hands. He recalled the sound of one of the surviving Vethori making that subsonic frequency. Not community this time. Something lower. Something that was, as close as Paul could translate it, grief. He sat down on the ground next to the fence line, in the smoke and the cold, and put his head in his hands and waited. The sheriff arrived 19 minutes later. Administrator Corvin arrived at the press conference 12 hours after that, and he was precisely as useful as Paul had predicted. A decorated veteran, a man who had lost his mind, a danger to the community he'd been welcomed into, a symbol of the exact kind of undisciplined compassion that led to outcomes like this, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unsupervised Vethori rehabilitation. The administrator used the word sympathizer twice. He used the phrase public safety 11 times. He didn't use the word arson because the investigation was ongoing, and using it would have required him to address the arson. Paul's arraignment was, Adira told him, procedurally flawless. They had made absolutely sure of that. There would be nothing to appeal on grounds of process. The charge was aggravated assault with intent. The maximum sentence was 14 years. The administrator had already given 3 interviews about restorative justice and community healing, and his personal commitment to ensuring that veterans received appropriate care, the appropriate care being, in context, a cell. There's a witness, Adira said on the 4th day. Paul looked up. One of the boys, the younger one. He's been trying to contact my office. Adira set her tablet down carefully. His name is Willem. He's 14. He was there. He says he didn't know what his brother was going to do. He was told they were just going to rattle your fence. Scare the Veth. Nothing serious. He says he wants to testify.
The administrator's son?
Yes. Paul was quiet for a long moment. Through the window of the detention facility's consultation room, he could see the tail end of the landing strip, and beyond it the green horizon line that meant the ionization fields, and beyond that, though he couldn't see it, his compound. What was left of it? He's 14, Paul said. Yes. His family is going to make his life extremely difficult. Almost certainly, yes. Paul thought about the young Vethori who had sent the emergency message, the one who'd tried to warn him, the one the county had designated 4 Gamma, the one who was probably no older than Willem in any terms that mattered. He thought about what it cost to do the right thing when the people who were supposed to protect you had decided you were inconvenient. Tell him yes, Paul said. The trial took 9 days. Reyes came every day and sat in the gallery, his cooling vest humming, his face doing the thing it did when he was working very hard not to show what he was feeling. The first Vethori, the one from Intake Bay 7, whose legal status as a ward of Paul's compound was now in dispute given the compound's destruction, was present as a material witness, the first time a Vethori had been formally recognized as such in any planetary court. Adira had spent 6 months building the precedent for that. She had the manner of someone who had been waiting her entire career for exactly this fight and was deeply pleased it had finally arrived. Willem Corvin testified on the sixth day. He was a small 14, smaller than Paul had expected. Looking at him across the courtroom, the kind of small that comes from being the younger one, the one always slightly behind. He testified in a flat, steady voice that his older brother, Caden, had organized the action, that it had been Caden who'd obtained the accelerant, that it had been Caden who'd told Willem to send the emergency message through the frequency that Paul had registered for exactly that purpose. He testified that he had not known there were Vethori inside the enclosure. He testified that when Caden and his friends had started laughing and said what they said, Willem had stepped back, and that if he could undo anything, it would be that step, that one backward step, instead of forward. He did not look at his father during the testimony. The administrator in the second row had the expression of a man who was recalculating a great many things at once. The jury took 4 hours. Paul had been acquitted of intent. He had not been acquitted of the assault itself. The charges were reduced significantly to a fray, with time served covering the sentence. He walked out of the courthouse into cold air and the green horizon, and Reyes standing on the steps with 2 coffees and the expression of a man trying to be casual about something that was the opposite of casual. "You look terrible," Reyes said. "Thank you." Reyes handed him the coffee. They stood there for a while, in the cold, not talking. The Vethori was there too, at the perimeter of the restricted zone. They hadn't been able to bring it inside the courthouse grounds, but it had been there every day, outside the fence line, cycling through colors that Paul's 2 years of close observation had made legible. Right now, it was a slow cycling amber. He knew what that meant. "I need to rebuild the enclosure," Paul said. "I know. I've got 11 of them now. 3 less than before." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "I called around. There's space in the auxiliary building at the VFW hall, temporary, while you rebuild." Paul looked at him. "You're not the only veteran in this county who thinks the detention facilities are a scandal," Reyes said. "I've just been talking to more of them recently." There was a sound behind them, the particular subsonic frequency, low and resonant, that Paul felt in his back teeth, in his chest, in the old shrapnel wound under his left shoulder blade that ached in the cold. He turned. The Vethori was at the fence line, watching him, its gill frills moving through slow amber into something he hadn't categorized before, a color between amber and gold, a frequency he didn't have a word for yet. He'd find one, given time. He usually did. "Come on," he said, to the Vethori, to Reyes, to the cold air and the green horizon, and the 11 surviving members of his unit. "Let's go home." He walked down the courthouse steps with his coffee, with his left hand trembling slightly in the cold, with Reyes beside him and the Vethori tracking along the fence line. And he did not look back at the building, or at the administrator, or at the reporters, or at any of the other things that wanted his attention. He looked at the road ahead, the green-edged sky, the distance between here and the compound he would rebuild, board by board, beam by beam, the way Marines rebuilt everything, the way dogs rebuilt trust after someone had broken it, slowly, stubbornly, without ceremony, because the work itself was the point. He thought about the ones he'd lost in the fire. He thought about Candle Basin. He thought about Lance Corporal Davis, who had gone on to retire with full honors and now ran a greenhouse in New Bastion. He thought about the specific weight of carrying something for so long your bones shaped themselves around it, and how sometimes on the other side of that, what you found wasn't exhaustion, but something harder and quieter and more useful. He thought about Willem Corvin, 14 years old, stepping forward instead of back. He drank his coffee. He kept walking. The first thing he did, when they reached the VFW auxiliary building and the 11 Vethori filed in from the transport, was stand at the door and look at each of them as they passed. The way he always did it, the way it had to be done, not for ceremony, but because they needed to know they were seen. "New start," he said to each of them in turn. Not new recruit. New start. He'd never said that before. It felt right. Outside, the green-edged sky was moving toward night, the ionization fields cooling from active to residual, the color shifting from alien green to something almost terrestrial, almost blue, almost familiar, the particular shade that existed at the edge of things, between what was and what might still become. Paul Marin stood in the doorway of a borrowed building in the scrub flats of a half-terraformed world, with 11 Vethori behind him and one former combat engineer sitting on an overturned crate making a joke about the quality of the heating rig, and thought, this is what it looks like. Not the finish line, Not the victory, just this. The ongoing, stubborn, unremarkable act of not leaving anyone behind. He stepped inside and pulled the door shut against the cold. Semper Fi.